Hello, my friends. Welcome. My name is Joe. This is the Joe Martino Show. And today we're going to talk about what does good empathy look like. If you've not been listening for a while, last week I brought up the idea that maybe we're misusing empathy. There are problems with how we're using it. And I asked for responses and I got them. I'm going to read 5, 6, 7 emails from the last two episodes. And I'm also going to talk about 5 steps that I think we need to consider when using empathy. Let's kick it off. This is the Joe Martino Show.
You're listening to the Joe Martino Show, a podcast dealing with all things emotional, relational, and human nature. Joe is a licensed counselor in the state of Michigan, specializing in relationship therapy. He is also the author of the book, The Emotionally Secure Couple. All advice offered in this episode is offered for entertainment and educational purposes only. Enjoy the show.
Well, my friends, welcome. I hope your day's going well wherever it is that you are at today. I hope that you are having a great day. For my YouTube watching friends, I have switched the motif today. For part 2, I've gone with the Dodgers hat and the Yankees hoodie. For my friends that just listen online, you're not going to care about that, and that's okay too. Heck, maybe my YouTube people don't care. I don't know. I do want to start the second part of maybe empathy alone isn't enough. And man, did I get some emails about that. We're going to talk about them. I'm going to read you a few here in just a minute. If you haven't heard the predecessor to this episode, if this is your first time here, I would encourage you to probably go ahead and take a look at episode 302 before you listen to this one. So the episode directly before this one, you're going to benefit from listening to that as you kind of listen to this one. This one could stand all alone, but I do think that it's going to be important for you to know kind of the context, which is in that episode, for those of you that still aren't going to do that, I talked about how I'm concerned that we are misusing empathy and that it is not enough by itself, that we actually have some bad definitions of empathy and that we need to talk about it. And it was amazing to me how many people won't even have the conversation. And some of it I get, like the one book that I'm reading, it's from a religious writer. He tends to be pretty far in one direction. He chooses a very provocative title, but people wouldn't even engage the idea that empathy could be misused. It's just wild to me that you won't even engage it. Like, and these are not people that I would consider typically, that they're people that typically don't engage things that they don't like. In fact, I actually find the exact opposite. Typically, these people are the people that absolutely engage in things they disagree with. They're looking for information. They're looking for refining. They're looking for all of those things. And they just would shut the conversation down before it started. And when we do that, what happens is we lose. Because if we can't talk about empathy, it does beg the question, then what if it is being misused? What if it is happening in a way that we need to talk about? And that doesn't mean that it's all of the time that it's being used, it's being misused. But what if it is being misused? What does that look like? And how do we navigate that? And so, like, for my friends, like, one guy's like, oh, this is Christian nationalism, which of course is the new buzzword, which doesn't have a very good definition. When I ask people, hey, tell me what Christian nationalism is, I have yet to get the same answer, even in the ballpark, other than it had the word Christian in it and they felt that they were patriots. I've asked about 7 people and I have gotten 7 different answers, 5 of which I wrote down. And when you look at it, you're like, what does this even mean? And somebody might get upset about that. I'm telling you, the emails were wild. We're going to need to read them. Let's do that right now. Okay, so I actually compiled some of my favorite lines from the emails. I do want to be clear. I did get some emails where the people were positive, but these 5 or 4 are just funny. I did cherry pick some lines, but you wrote into my podcast, so I get to cherry pick your emails. Dear Joe, it's clear that you've never been educated in mental health or what empathy actually is. I feel bad for your wife and children. What is it like having such a cavernous head? Kudos for using the word cavernous. Dear Joe, I'm sorry to hear that you are a Christian nationalist who believes that empathy can be a sin. Dear Joe, I hope you're... Oh, and by the way, they didn't all say Dear Joe, but I had to find a format so you knew which ones I was distinguishing between. Dear Joe, I heard your stupid podcast about men. Just in case you didn't know, the woman put up a new video explaining that her husband is just fine and that people like you who thought she was wrong don't have a sense of humor. Yes, Kim, I know. And let me just say that we're going to address that next week. Dear Joe, this one's one of my favorites. I slogged through your episode on empathy, and I have to say I'm rather disappointed. Clearly you were undereducated. Well, I mean, I'm moving up now, right? Because earlier I was not educated. Clearly you were undereducated and on empathy. It says and empathy, but we'll change it. On empathy and how it works. You are undereducated. Okay, you said that twice. That's repetitive redundancy. You are clearly undereducated. Wow, 3 times. On how you said and again, or you wrote and again, on how the brain works and living off of a 50-year-old model. Perhaps your alt-right upbringing is still running around in your head for free. So, wow, since I was 1 year old. Dear Joe, I would not want to be your wife. I listened to your last 2 episodes. How dare you say that woman having a sense of humor was wrong? How dare you suggest that Brene Brown is wrong? How dare you, I'm going to assume, suggest, there's no verb there, that empathy could be misused. Empathy is the greatest gift we have to help people heal. Can you give actual examples of how it's been misused? Probably not. And then here's my favorite, loser. There is actually more. Those are just my favorites. I did have to pause. I spilled my coffee all over my desk, got it on my hoodie. Yeah, there was more. Those were just my favorites that I decided to go with. And so that's what we did, or that's what I did. And yes, I can give examples. I feel like I did that last week, but I'm going to give a few more this week. One of the things that happens with empathy is empathy has gotten defined as if I feel bad, I'm right. And if you suggest that I'm not, you don't have empathy. That's a misuse of empathy. If I have a bad feeling, and this is going on in my town right now, there's a woman who's very vocal about the schools, and a lot of the arguments on both sides of it, outside of the school, I don't really know what the school is saying. I want to be clear on that. But a lot of the arguments amongst people around her is about like and dislike, and around the school is around like and dislike. And if you disagree with the person, you clearly just can't see it from their point of view, which is what empathy is supposed to be. That's a misuse of empathy. And again, I'm blown away by the idea that people won't even engage the possibility that empathy could be misused. I want to talk today, and I'm going to make a pivot here for the second half of this episode. I want to talk today about how do we use empathy in a good way. But I'll give you one more. There are parents who will rob their children of the natural consequences of their choices because they have empathy for them. They can feel what they were feeling. That's illogical, and it's bad empathy, right? When we remove most of the parenting that we make fun of is built off of selfish empathy. And remember last week I said empathy that is used to soften, to create a space that I can inhabit where I'm not uncomfortable isn't really empathy. And a lot of what we have happening in parenting, the helicopter parents, the lawnmower parents, that's empathy gone awry. And yes, it's selfish because a lot of how we're taught about empathy is selfish. I'm offended, therefore I'm right. And if you don't believe that, you don't have empathy. I've heard that. I've had people tell me that. I've had people say that in the room. And you, the longtime listeners, know when I say the room, I mean my therapy room in session. And so what happens is when they start to engage the conversation, the minute we get to where I feel bad, if you don't feel bad for me, if you can't sit there with me, and to quote Brene Brown, who I went after pretty hard last week, going to do it again this week, still going to read her stuff, still have my own issues with her, but you'll notice I'm still engaging her. But my beef with Brene is, it's just, yeah, me too. Okay, like, yeah, that's helpful. That is helpful. But what about when it isn't you two? In my town, a young man died on his birthday. He was 23 years old. He died in 3 p.m. in a car wreck. I cannot go to his parents and be like, yeah, me too. If the definition of empathy is, yeah, me too, and if you don't believe me, that's what she says, look it up. It's all over the interwebs, since I'm running off of something that I learned 50 years ago. It's all over the internet. Yeah, me too. That's the response. That's only halfway home. So today I want to talk about what is the other half. How do we get the rest of the way home? All right, so let's talk about a few ways that it goes awry, and then how do we change that, right? Empathy fatigue is probably the one that even the most, like, people who won't engage me in the conversation, they agree that it exists. And probably the most common way that we see this is when there are people like nurses. My daughter's studying to be a nurse, counselors. We used to talk about this, not in these terms. These terms weren't quite that popular yet when I worked at a mental hospital. And empathy fatigue is where you have constant exposure to someone else's pain and not very good boundaries, right? And you become somewhat enmeshed where their pain is your pain. Again, this is not good empathy. How do we overcome that? Well, we have to have boundaries. How about misplaced empathy and enabling behavior? This is the one I talked about with parenting, right? Misplaced empathy and will often be used by parents to enable their children to be consequence-free from bad behavior. And what it is it's empathy for the short-term suffering. One of the things that can happen when we are I'm just going to sit there with you, we have to kind of examine the suffering, right? My friend I just ran into a friend yesterday who lost his job 2 weeks ago. That level of empathy, hey man, I'm sorry, that sucks. I have been there. Me too. Wow. Oh, life is hard right now. That's empathy that I can do. I can sit there with them. The people who lost their child, I can't sit there with them. I can, but not if empathy is this, yeah, me too. One of the ones that we don't talk about a lot is empathy leading to bias or biased empathy, right? And an example of this would be, what about a juror who feels deep empathy for a defendant who's probably guilty, but it reminds them of their own childhood? Well, I grew up poor too. In fact, in Charles Duhigg's latest book, he actually talks about, in a good way, he's for it. One of the examples is a juror, because it's about super communication. One of the jurors actually uses super communication to use empathy gone awry. And really all it is it's empathy creating a bias, which I want to know. We say bias is bad, but then we're like, well, but if it's out of empathy, it's okay. Well, which is it? One of the ones that's difficult for us to understand is that manipulators are really good at empathizing, right? And it can go either way. You can be manipulated by someone you're empathizing with, but really good manipulators are good at empathizing. They will empathize with you to manipulate you. And I think this is why when I bring up like, hey, maybe empathy isn't completely good, we just take that category and we make it its own thing and we kind of divorce it from empathy, which is okay. But we can use empathy to understand and justify toxic behavior. I see this a lot with couples, right? The husband is abusive and the wife says, well, he had a really hard childhood. The wife is abusive and engaging in really dangerous activities. Well, she had a really hard childhood, like her dad. And we'll even hear this as like, especially in church settings, you will hear, well, what about his father wound? Well, what about all the wounds he's perpetuating on people? Do we have empathy for his victims? If we don't have empathy for his victims and we only have empathy for his father wound, I'm super confused. How do we choose who gets empathy and who doesn't? Empathy hijacking. And this happens a lot in politics. They'll hijack your empathy. They'll tell an emotional story, right? It's a logical fallacy. Logical fallacy is appeal to emotion. And they only show you one side of the argument, of course, because they want to win. Politics has become it's like baseball. It's about winning. And so what they will do is they will manipulate you to bypass critical thinking by stomping on your empathy trigger. And if you don't believe that happens, go watch some political ads. There are people that are really good at arguing this way. I've met them in my therapy room. They will argue for what they want in their marriage by stomping on the empathy trigger. It's okay that I literally had a woman tell me this. It's okay that I screamed at my husband at 2:30 in the morning because I had a really hard childhood. And the only way I learned to deal with that hard childhood was to get out what I had going on right away. And if my husband can't empathize with that, her word, not mine, if my husband can't empathize with that, he has problems. And when I share that story, when I'm trying to have a conversation, people are like, okay, well, maybe that was a misuse of empathy. But wait, but you just said we can't misuse empathy. Which is it? And the last one that I want to talk about is losing boundaries real quickly, because we see this in therapy. A few years ago, I was talking to a therapist. He was seeing a guy that I had referred to him. The guy's wife was having an affair. She tells him, hey, look, I want a divorce. Goes and tells the guy that she's having the affair with, hey, I told my husband I want a divorce. The guy that she was having the affair with was like, well, I don't want to marry you. Like, I don't want to leave my wife. This was just fun on the side. So they decided to work it out. And I couldn't fit all of that into my schedule. So I sent them to him. I sent the husband to him. The guy, I'm talking to the therapist, like, hey, how is that going? This is a pretty common therapy thing. Like, hey, how is that going? And we were connected in a way that it was a therapeutic upstream, downstream conversation. And so he's like, well, I don't know. I'm really struggling. I told the client that I'm angry for him because I'm sitting in his pain. He lost perspective because he had too much empathy. His empathy was untethered. It wasn't tethered to anything else. And for a therapist who can't tether their empathy to the therapeutic process, which is we are here to help this person heal, they'll get lost. That guy isn't in therapy anymore. He can't handle it. Well, Joe, maybe that's just him. Well, there's a lot of therapists that has happened to. Empathy is no good if it isn't tethered to other virtues and values. And we know this with every other thing that we talk about. We talk about balance. Well, maybe not every other thing. Actually, that may not be true. The carnivore diet, not based on balance, right? When you talk to carnivore diet people, they're like, well, all I can do is talk about results, which is what the vegan people talk about, even though they're completely out of balance in opposite directions. And to which I would say, I'm not interested in any diet that tells me I can't eat an apple. I'm not. I'm also not interested in any diet that tells me I can't eat steak. But I digress. So how do we engage moving forward? Well, first of all, I do want to start with, I think the most commonly accepted definition of empathy. I think healthy empathy will sit with the person, and it may not say anything at all. Healthy empathy will sit with the person, and it may not say anything at all. And that's okay. It's just sitting there. It is just a presence. Healthy empathy doesn't try to fix it. It does feel the other person's pain. It does sit there with them. It does embrace just being there with them. And that is important. But healthy empathy also knows that the point of empathy isn't empathy. I was teaching mirroring last night to a group of people. And I told them, look, the point of this isn't this. I talked about this in last week's episode. The point of this isn't this. It's tethered to a purpose. And that purpose in mirroring is to move the conversation forward, to make sure that both people feel heard. Good empathy is also tethered to a purpose. And that purpose is that whatever that person is feeling, we're not going to just sit here forever. Now, we might wait till they're ready, or we might have to hey, is it time? We might have to nudge them. But when we nudge them, it is for their good, because that is the greater purpose that we are attaching what we're doing to. That is the greater purpose that we are attaching our empathy to. What does it mean to sit with them and hope for more for them? Right? So we're just going to sit with the person, but we want to tether our empathy to a purpose that is greater than just sitting there with them. We want to tether our empathy to other values. We want to have it be a part of the toolkit, not the whole toolkit. We actually want to tether it to compassion. We want to tether it to sympathy, which is the one that I don't get that people vilify. We want to attach it to growth. Yes, I can sit in a room with people and I can have empathy about the great pain that they have been in. I would say that on any given week, half my clients have been sexually assaulted. And I can sit with them and feel that pain. I can empathize with them. I was sexually assaulted as a kid. But if that's all the further we go, I'm never going to be a very effective therapist. I'm not going to be someone that is actually going to help people. We need our empathy to be attached to compassion, sympathy, and growth. It has to be a part of the toolbox. Just like a hammer doesn't make a whole toolbox, it makes part of a toolbox. Empathy is a tool, but it's not the only tool. Empathy that says, hey, let's just sit in this mess and never do anything about it isn't helpful. It actually says, hey, let's sit here for a minute and let's let our emotions process. Let's let our emotions run through, and maybe we do that 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Who knows? We're gonna let our empathy run here for a little bit. We're going to let our feelings feel, right? Emotional regulation, feel all the feelings, bring harm to no one. And then we're going to talk about growth. Then we're going to talk about how do we respond to whatever it is we're experiencing. The problem I have with the Brene Brown analogy is she not so subtly implies that the person putting the ladder down into the hole or the well and walking over and sitting down with the person should never say, hey, there is a ladder there that we could use. Maybe we should go climb up that ladder and get out of here and go figure out a new path forward, which I find super interesting because I still do read her stuff. And in another book, she talks about how, I'll clean it up for the FCC. Our crappy first draft in our head is rarely true, right? She talks about how we make a story in our head about what's going on. I don't think she calls it a story. That's what I call it. But she compares it to someone writing a book, and she's like, the first draft is always bad. And a lot of times when we're feeling deep pain, the deep pain that we're feeling is being interpreted with the first draft. And so, yeah, hey, you know what? Come sit with the person. And I get it. We have examples of things that are not helpful. A couple of years ago, I had to get tires on my car. I had a bunch of big expenses hit, like back to back to back to back. And a person in my life called me. I'm pretty sure they don't listen to this podcast, but just in case they do, I'm almost certain they don't. But anyhow, he calls me. We're talking. He says, what are you doing? I said, I'm walking to the tire store because I had to get tires on my car. And it was $1,000. And I'm just pissed because I don't have $1,000 handy right now. His response wasn't, oh, that sucks, or gee, that's hard. It was, well, just be thankful that you're in a place where you can do that. Not helpful, Bill. Not helpful at all. And that's not empathy. But empathy is, hey, you know what? That sucks. Yeah. And we could probably stop there because it's tires, right? And we have to start with the place that because not every interaction or let me back up from that. Not every problem is the same, then not every interaction should be the same. And not every use of empathy will be the same. It's kind of like spoons in your spoon drawer, right? Like you have like the little teaspoons, and then you have the soup spoons, which I use for cereal. And then you've got like the ladle spoons that somehow there's as many of them and they're in there and like, you can't get them in your mouth. I think the problem with how we use empathy currently is it is all one thing. And so good empathy does not fall into the trap that just because you feel bad someone has wronged you, or, and this is the one that really pisses people off, nor does it accept the idea that because you're upset, you have the right to be upset. Maybe you misinterpreted what happened. Maybe your crappy first draft needs editing and revision. Thank you, Brene Brown. Now, we can do that in a winsome way. We can do that in a way that is empathetic. We can sit there for a while and allow the person to feel the feelings, but we've got to do that in a greater context. We've got to do that in a context that is attached, that is tied to a purpose of moving the person forward, of helping the person grow. Real friends help people grow, help each other grow. This is the thing. I've said this before. If you listen to my episode on parenting or any of my rants on parenting, people are like, I want to be my kid's friend. I do. I want to be my kid's friend. I don't want to be their buddy. And I think it's, again, words matter. And I think it's, again, we have conflated those two words. Buddy and friend are the same thing. No. A buddy just cares about where you're at and they don't care about you growing. A friend cares about where you're at and they care about you growing. Good empathy wants you to grow. It doesn't want you to get stuck. So I have a client, her brother died. We're talking. It has been a hard year. And I tell her all the time, I feel terrible for you. That's awful. And I also tell her, hey, here's one activity I want you to try this week that will help you start to move forward. Now, we can do that without judgment. We can do that without, right? For those of you who can't see, I'm doing the mean mug and the pointing finger. We can do that without being bossy, but we want to offer paths forward. Let me walk with you. Let me take steps forward with you. That's real empathy. It moves beyond just sitting in the stink of the problem and says, how do we move together forward together, so that eventually I can peel off and you can keep walking your path. That's good empathy. Okay, one more email. Guy writes in and says, Dear Joe, it sounds like you're about judging people. I can't believe you would suggest that it's wrong to have empathy. Empathy is what gets us through. Empathy is what drives us forward. Okay, but Frank, I make up the names. Like I don't even read them when we move them over to the paper that I read on. When I move them over to the paper that I read off of, I don't even look at the name unless I've talked to the person and we've gone that way. But Frank, right now we're not using empathy to move people forward. We're using it to justify violent behavior against other people, right? The people that did whatever they did January 6th, empathy was their driving thing. I've talked to them. I've had people stop talking to me because I was like, help me understand why that was right. How can you say that? What about the people who were wrong? They stole an election. And then the people who turned around and mistreat those people, same thing, right? And one of the things that has happened is once we move empathy to its own end, to its own position of deity, we lose a higher sense of right and wrong. And good empathy is tied securely to a higher sense of right or wrong. We've been having a fun conversation in my house, and by fun I mean not so much, but kind of fun, about can you think that someone is engaged in bad behavior regularly and still measure out their points? Like, can you take each behavior on its own? And so I'll have this conversation with people about teachers. Well, the teachers are doing this and the teachers are doing that. And I always say to them, okay, you know what? Maybe that's right. But what we're talking about here is the teachers that are doing this. What does that look like as far as right and wrong? Is what they're doing on this thing that we're talking about, is that right or wrong? Where does our sense and source of right and wrong come? Right? So people who are upset with the current administration, people who are upset with Elon Musk, one of the things that they're doing is it is okay to have graffiti. Not all of them. I want to be clear on this. Not all of them, but a good chunk of them, it is okay to have graffiti, to graffiti someone else's private property, to burn buildings that sell Elon Musk cars, which, by the way, I've always thought were ugly and never understood why anyone would buy them. It's okay to do wrong because of empathy. That doesn't sound very good to me. In fact, that sounds like empathy not tethered to higher values, a higher sense of right or wrong, right? Like, we call for respect and we believe we should have respect until people have a different view from us on immigration, until people have a different view from us on Trump. And listen, that's on both sides of it, on all of it. We talk, there's a group of people that stand on a street corner in my town and they preach and yell at cars. And I want to go down, if I'm honest, I want to go down and make fun of them. But if I have a higher sense of right or wrong, it is wrong to go make fun of them. I'm not saying it's wrong to go challenge them. I don't even think it would be wrong. It would probably be a waste of my energy. But I don't even think it would be wrong for me to go down to the street corner and challenge what they're doing, like try to engage them in a conversation. But it would be wrong to go make fun of them or to somehow, I've heard people, I want to bring harm to them. Oh, I don't want to bring harm to them. That's empathy for the people they're shouting at that isn't tethered to something higher. Well, but don't you think they're hurting people's feelings? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I doubt it because nobody can hear them, right? Like, who drives with their windows down in Michigan in February? Not many people. I did last week because it was like 70 for 26 minutes, right? And so we have to have empathy that is tethered to a higher sense of right and wrong. And a lot of the really big button issues that we have in our society, we don't talk about the right and wrong. We talk about the empathy. Abortion is not typically talked about in terms of right or wrong. It's talked about in terms of empathy. Both sides. Almost any political issue is not talked about in terms of right or wrong. It's talked about in terms of empathy. I had a conversation in grad school. So a long time ago, remember, whatever the name was that wrote in, I'm using models that I learned 50 years ago. I wasn't in grad school 50 years ago. But I had a conversation with somebody in grad school and they were like, well, I feel like I'm being discriminated against because I didn't get this position. Well, okay, but you're not, like, it's a position for men. That organization has said they wanted a man for religious reasons. They didn't discriminate against you. Yes, they did. Why can't you have empathy for my feelings? I can. But empathy that allows you to stay in thought patterns that perpetuate victimhood are not tied to a higher sense of right and wrong. They're not tied to growth. They're not tethered to other values. It's not tethered to other values. And it does you no good. It trades long-term growth for the avoidance of short-term pain. But the short-term pain doesn't go away. You still have it. You just sit in it longer. I'd actually argue that a lot of the ways we use empathy today causes people to sit in their discomfort longer. It causes people to be distressed longer because all we care about is, well, how do you feel? Well, that's a good starting spot. It really is. And that's why I want to be clear. Good empathy starts with sitting with the person. It starts with expressing, man, that would suck. Oh, I'm so sorry. It starts with expressing, yeah, me too. And sometimes it starts with not saying anything, but it has to be attached to a purpose. If empathy is the point of empathy, we're going to have problems. And they're in our world today. And to say that, well, a lot of people who are talking about this right now are alt-right and they are Christian nationalists. I love that argument because I actually said to a guy, I was like, okay, well, wait, but what about this guy who's an atheist? He's not a Christian. He's not Republican. He is not a nationalist. Or what about this guy? He's a gay man from England. Well, that doesn't count because it doesn't match your narrative. That's why it doesn't count. That's a really terrifying way to live. All right, part 2, this is it. How do we have good empathy? We sit with the person. We tether that empathy to a purpose. We tether it to other values like compassion, sympathy, and the need for growth. We care about walking forward and not just staying where we're at. And we operate out of a higher sense of right or wrong. In other words, empathy has to fit in our sense of right and wrong. All right, hey, I asked for emails last week and I got them. Email me this week. Tell me what you think. For some of my friends that I quoted, do you still think I'm uneducated? I really want to know. All right, thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share with a friend. And hey, give us that rating in your podcast store. Until next time, change possible.